The alarm clock buzzed at 5 in the morning, cutting through the silence of the small apartment like a knife. Robert's hand shot out from under the blanket, fumbling to shut it off before it could wake his 2 kids sleeping in the next room. He lay there for just a moment, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, gathering the strength to face another day. 3 years. It had been 3 years since he lost his wife to cancer, and some days it still felt like yesterday. The medical bills from her treatment had piled up, so high that he sometimes wondered if he'd ever see the top of that mountain of debt. But he couldn't think about that right now. He had 2 beautiful children depending on him, and that meant getting up. No matter how tired he felt, Robert pulled himself out of bed and shuffled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. The man staring back at him in the mirror looked older than 38. Dark circles hung under his eyes like permanent shadows, and his face seemed to carry the weight of every worry he tried to hide from his kids. He got dressed quickly in his warehouse uniform and headed to the kitchen. The apartment was small, just 2 bedrooms, but it was home, or at least it had been. Robert's eyes drifted to the papers he'd stuffed in the drawer yesterday, the ones with red letters stamped across the top. Eviction notice. 2 months behind on rent. He had 14 days to come up with the money, or they'd be out on the street. His stomach twisted. But he pushed the thought away. Not now. First, breakfast for the kids. Robert started making pancakes. The cheap mix from the discount store that he could stretch across several meals. As the batter sizzled on the pan, he heard small footsteps padding down the hallway. His daughter Amy appeared in the doorway, her hair messy from sleep, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. "Morning, sweetie," Robert said, forcing brightness into his voice. "Pancakes okay?" Amy nodded, climbing onto one of the kitchen chairs. At 10 years old, she was becoming more observant, more aware of things he wished he could shield her from. She watched him with those big brown eyes, so much like her mother's, and Robert wondered what she could see that he was trying to hide. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked quietly. "Of course, honey. Why wouldn't I be?" He flipped a pancake, keeping his back to her so she wouldn't see his face. He looked tired, really tired. Robert turned around with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm fine. Just need some coffee, that's all." His son Tommy came stumbling out next, rubbing his eyes. At 7 years old, he was still young enough to believe everything was fine if his dad said so. Robert was grateful for that innocence, even as he dreaded the day it would fade. They ate breakfast together at their small kitchen table, and Robert listened to Tommy talk excitedly about the science project he was working on at school. Amy was quieter, picking at her pancakes, and Robert could feel her worried glances. She knew something was wrong. Kids always knew. "Amy, you have your school play coming up next week, right?" Robert asked, trying to lighten the mood. Her face brightened a little. "Yeah, on Wednesday. I'm playing one of the townspeople. It's not a big part, but ... double quotes." She trailed off, looking hopeful. "I'll be there," Robert promised, even though he had no idea how he'd make it work. Wednesday was one of his longest days, warehouse shift until 6. Then he needed to drive for the rideshare app until at least midnight to make enough money. But he'd find a way. He always did. After breakfast, Robert rushed through getting the kids ready for school. Backpacks, lunchboxes, shoes tied, homework checked. The morning routine was a well-rehearsed dance. Every movement automatic after 3 years of doing it alone. He dropped them off at school, watching them walk through the gates with their friends. Tommy ran ahead without looking back, but Amy turned and waved, her expression still worried. Robert waved back with a big smile until she disappeared into the building. The moment they were gone, his smile faded. He sat in his old car for a moment, resting his forehead against the steering wheel. The check engine light had been on for 2 weeks. He couldn't afford to fix it. He couldn't afford anything. Robert's phone buzzed with a notification. A text from his landlord. "Need to talk about rent? Call me today." Deleted the message and started the car. The engine coughed, but started, and Robert whispered a quiet thank you to no one in particular. Just a little longer. The car just needed to hold on a little longer. The warehouse job was hard work, but Robert didn't mind. Physical labor kept his mind busy, kept him from thinking too much. He spent the morning loading and unloading boxes, organizing inventory, and dealing with delivery schedules. His back ached, but that was normal now. Everything ached. During his break, his coworker David sat down beside him. "Man, you look rough." "Late night." "Every night's a late night," Robert said with a weak laugh. "Driving until midnight, then up at 5? How long can you keep this up?" Robert shrugged. "As long as I have to." David shook his head. "You're going to burn out. Can't afford to burn out." The conversation died there, both of them knowing there was nothing more to say. Robert had heard it all before. Take care of yourself. You can't pour from an empty cup. Ask for help. But who was he supposed to ask? His parents were gone. His wife's parents had moved across the country after she died, unable to stay in the place that reminded them of their daughter. He had a brother in another state, but they barely talked anymore. No, this was his responsibility. His kids, his problem, his solution. The afternoon dragged on. Robert's mind kept wandering to the eviction notice hidden in his drawer. 14 days. Where was he supposed to come up with that kind of money? He'd already picked up every extra shift he could. He was already working himself to exhaustion. Maybe he could sell something. But what? They barely had anything worth selling. His wife's wedding ring. The thought made his chest tight. He'd promised himself he'd give it to Amy one day. But if it meant keeping a roof over their heads? No, not yet. There had to be another way. When his warehouse shift ended, Robert sat in his car in the parking lot, staring at the rideshare app on his phone. He needed to make at least $80 tonight to cover groceries for the week. More would be better. Every dollar counted, but he was so tired. His whole body felt heavy, like he was moving through water. For just a moment, Robert let himself imagine what it would be like to go home, make dinner with his kids, help them with homework, and just go to bed at a normal hour. To sleep through the whole night without an alarm? To wake up rested? He could almost feel what that would be like. Then his phone buzzed with another notification, this time from the credit card company. Payment overdue. Robert closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. He opened the rideshare app and turned on availability. Within seconds, a ride request pinged. Robert accepted it and started his car, pulling out of the parking lot as the sun began to set. Another night, another dollar. This was his life now, and somewhere between the exhaustion and the worry, he'd stopped imagining it would ever be different. All he could do was survive one more day. For Amy, for Tommy, that was enough reason to keep going, even when everything else felt impossible. The next morning came too quickly. Robert had driven until 1 a.m, making just enough to cover groceries and a little extra toward the rent. When the alarm went off at 5, his body screamed in protest. Every muscle ached. His eyes felt like sandpaper. But the routine didn't stop for exhaustion. He got the kids ready, made breakfast, dropped them at school, and headed straight to the warehouse. The morning passed in a blur of boxes and conveyor belts and the constant beeping of forklifts. By the time his lunch break came at noon, Robert felt like he could barely stand. His supervisor noticed him leaning against a stack of pallets. "Go take your break, Robert. You look like you're about to fall over." Robert nodded and grabbed his lunch bag from his locker. He'd packed the same thing he always did, a peanut butter sandwich and an apple. It wasn't much, but it would get him through the rest of the shift. Instead of eating in the break room, where his coworkers would try to make conversation he didn't have energy for, Robert decided to walk to the small park across the street. It was a nice day, unusually warm for this time of year, and he thought the fresh air might wake him up a little. The park wasn't much, just a patch of grass with some benches, a fountain in the center, and a few trees that provided shade. But it was quiet, and quiet was exactly what Robert needed. He sat down on a bench near the fountain, unwrapped his sandwich, and closed his eyes for just a moment. Letting the sound of the water wash over him, he thought about Amy's school play next Wednesday. He'd promised her he'd be there, and he meant it. Maybe he could skip his rideshare shift that night, just this once. She'd looked so hopeful when he said he'd come. He couldn't disappoint her. Robert was halfway through his sandwich when he heard someone gasp nearby. His eyes snapped open, and he saw an older woman standing near the fountain, about 20 feet away. She was dressed in an expensive-looking coat and elegant clothes, the kind of outfit that didn't belong in this neighborhood. Her hand was pressed against her chest, and even from a distance, Robert could see the pain written across her face. For a split second, he froze. Then his instincts kicked in. Robert dropped his sandwich and ran toward her. Ma'am, are you okay?" The woman tried to speak, but no words came out. Her face had gone pale and she was swaying on her feet. Robert caught her just as her knees buckled, lowering her gently to the ground. "Someone call 911. He shouted to the few other people in the park. A jogger pulled out his phone. Robert turned his full attention to the woman in front of him. She was conscious, but barely, breathing shallow and rapid. Her lips were starting to turn blue. Robert had seen this before, years ago, when he'd volunteered as a firefighter before Amy was born. Heart attack. This was a heart attack. "Stay with me," Robert said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Help is coming. Just stay with me." The woman's eyes found his, wide with fear. Then they rolled back, and she stopped breathing. No, Robert muttered, immediately positioning himself to start CPR. His hands found the center of her chest, and he began compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted in his head, keeping the rhythm steady. It had been years since his training, but the movements came back like muscle memory through 30 compressions. Then he tilted her head back and gave 2 rescue breaths. Nothing. He went back to compressions, pressing hard, feeling her ribs flex under his palms. Around him, a small crowd had gathered, but Robert barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to this woman and keeping her heart beating. "Come on," he whispered. "Come on. Don't give up." Sweat dripped down his face. His arms burned from the effort. 30 more compressions, 2 more breaths. Still nothing. The jogger was on the phone with the dispatcher, giving their location. Robert could hear sirens in the distance, but they sounded so far away, he couldn't stop. If he stopped, she'd die. So he kept going, compressions and breaths, over and over. His lunch break was definitely over by now. He'd probably get written up for this. But none of that mattered. "Please," Robert said, not sure if he was talking to the woman, or to God, or to the universe itself. "Please don't die." And then, like a miracle, the woman gasped. Her eyes flew open, and she sucked in a desperate breath of air. Robert nearly sobbed with relief. He rolled her onto her side as she coughed and gasped, making sure her airway stayed clear. "You're okay," he said, his hand on her shoulder. "You're breathing. The ambulance is almost here. You're going to be okay." The woman's hand reached up and gripped his arm with surprising strength. Her lips moved, trying to form words, but she couldn't quite manage it. Robert just shook his head. "Don't try to talk. Save your energy. Help is coming." The ambulance arrived less than a minute later, which felt like an eternity. Paramedics rushed over with their equipment, and Robert moved back to give them space. His hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. One of the paramedics, a young guy with kind eyes, looked up at him. "You did CPR?" Robert nodded. "It's probably saved her life." "Good work." They loaded the woman onto a stretcher, hooking her up to monitors and an oxygen mask. As they wheeled her toward the ambulance, she turned her head, searching for Robert. When she found him, she reached out her hand. Without thinking, Robert walked alongside the stretcher and took her hand. "You're going to be fine," he said again. "Are you family?" one of the paramedics asked. "No, I just... ... I was here. You should come to the hospital, give a statement about what happened. Plus, she seems to want you there." Robert glanced at his watch. His lunch break had ended 15 minutes ago. He should get back to work. He couldn't afford to lose this job. But looking at the woman's frightened eyes behind the oxygen mask, still holding onto his hand like a lifeline, he couldn't just walk away. "Okay," he said. "I'll come." They let him ride in the ambulance, sitting on the small bench seat while the paramedics worked. The woman never let go of his hand the entire ride. Robert watched the monitors, seeing her heart rate stabilize, her oxygen levels improve. She was going to make it. At the hospital, everything became a whirlwind of activity. Doctors and nurses swarmed around the woman, wheeling her away to the cardiac unit. Robert stood in the emergency room hallway, suddenly feeling very out of place in his dirty warehouse uniform, his hands still trembling slightly. A nurse approached him with a clipboard. "Sir, can you tell me what happened?" Robert explained everything, from the moment he saw her collapse to starting CPR to the ambulance arriving. The nurse wrote it all down, nodding. "You saved her life," she said simply. "That was very brave." Robert shook his head. "I just did what anyone would do. Not everyone knows CPR. Not everyone would have acted so fast." She smiled at him. "She's lucky you were there." After giving his statement, Robert checked his phone. 23 missed calls from work. His stomach dropped. He called back immediately, and his supervisor picked up on the first ring. "Robert, where the hell are you?" "I'm so sorry. There was an emergency. A woman had a heart attack in the park, and I had to help her. And then I had to come to the hospital to give a statement, and whoa, slow down. Is she okay?" "Yeah, I think so. They said she's stable."
Oh.
There was a pause. "All right. Get back here as soon as you can. We'll figure it out." Robert hung up and looked down the hallway to ward where they'd taken the woman. He should ask for her name, make sure she was really okay. But doctors and nurses were rushing back and forth, and everyone looked busy. He was just a warehouse worker who happened to be in the right place at the right time. They didn't need him here. Quietly, Robert slipped out of the hospital and headed back to work. He didn't leave his name. He didn't ask for thanks. He just left, because that's what you did. You helped people when they needed it, and then you moved on with your life. He had no idea that the woman he'd saved was one of the wealthiest people in the country. He had no idea that his life was about to change forever. All he knew was that he'd done the right thing, and now he had to get back to work before he lost his job. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives look like ordinary ones until much later. Catherine Westwood opened her eyes to the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital room. For a moment, she had no idea where she was or how she'd gotten there. The last thing she remembered was walking through the park on her way to a business meeting, and then a crushing pain in her chest that felt like an elephant sitting on her ribcage. "Mrs. Westwood, can you hear me?" A doctor's face appeared above her, kind but concerned. "You're in the hospital. You had a massive heart attack. Try not to move too much." Catherine tried to speak, but her throat was raw, probably from the breathing tube they'd just removed. She managed a small nod instead. Around her, she could hear the steady beep of monitors and the hushed voices of nurses. "You're very lucky," the doctor continued. "Someone performed CPR on you immediately. Without that intervention, you wouldn't have made it. Your heart stopped for almost 3 minutes." The fog in Catherine's mind began to clear. She remembered now. The pain. Falling. And then a man's face, looking down at her with determination and kindness. A voice telling her to stay with him, to keep fighting. Strong hands on her chest, refusing to let her slip away. The man Catherine croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "Who was he?" The doctor looked puzzled. "We're not sure. He came to the hospital with you in the ambulance, gave a statement to the nurse, and then left. He didn't leave his name." Catherine felt a strange mixture of gratitude and frustration. Someone had saved her life, literally brought her back from death, and she didn't even know who he was. She owed him everything, and he'd just disappeared. Over the next few hours, Catherine's private hospital room filled with people. Her son Richard arrived first, his face pale with worry. Then her daughter Jennifer, who burst into tears the moment she saw her mother awake. Her grandchildren came, her business partners, her personal assistant. Everyone wanted to know what happened, wanted to tell her how scared they'd been, but Catherine kept asking the same question. "Who saved me? Has anyone found out who he was?" Nobody knew. The hospital staff could only tell her that he was a man in his late 30s, wearing a warehouse uniform, who'd performed excellent CPR and stayed with her until the ambulance arrived. The nurse remembered he'd seemed worried about getting back to work. "That was it. Need to find him," Catherine said to her son that evening. "I need to thank him properly." Richard nodded. "I'll take care of it, Mom. You just focus on getting better." Catherine Westwood wasn't someone who left debts unpaid. especially a debt this big. The next morning, still in her hospital bed, she had her assistant contact the best private investigator in the city. She also had her people pull security footage from every camera near that park. The footage came back grainy and unclear. The park had one old security camera that barely worked, and the angle wasn't great. They could see a figure running to help her, could see him performing CPR, but his face was obscured. The ambulance blocked most of the view when it arrived. The investigator tried facial recognition software, but the image quality was too poor. There has to be something, Catherine insisted. What about the warehouse across from the park? He was wearing a uniform. Start there. The investigator contacted every business in the area. But most warehouses employed dozens of men who fit the general description. Without a clear photo or a name, it was like finding a needle in a haystack. That's when Richard suggested going public. What if we put out a news story? Ask for the public's help? Catherine agreed immediately. Within 2 days, every major news station in the city was running the story. Billionaire businesswoman saved by mystery hero read the headlines. They showed the grainy security footage, explained what happened, and asked anyone with information to come forward. Catherine's assistant set up a tip line. They offered a reward. Not that Catherine thought the man who'd saved her cared about money. Something about the way he'd acted, the fact that he'd left without even giving his name, told her he wasn't the type to do good deeds for recognition, but she had to try. Meanwhile, across the city, Robert had no idea any of this was happening. The day after the incident in the park, he'd gotten a warning at work for his extended absence, but his supervisor had been understanding once he explained. Robert had put the whole thing out of his mind. He had bigger problems to worry about. The eviction notice was still sitting in his drawer. He now had 10 days to come up with the money. 10 days before he and his kids would be homeless. The thought kept him up at night, more than usual. He'd been picking up every rideshare request he could, driving until 2 and 3 in the morning. But it still wasn't enough. On Tuesday evening, Robert was helping Amy with her math homework when she suddenly looked up at him with tears in her eyes. Dad, are we going to lose our apartment? Robert's stomach clenched. What? Why would you think that? Amy pulled a crumpled paper from her backpack. The eviction notice. The one Robert thought he'd hidden so carefully. I found it yesterday when I was looking for a pencil in the kitchen drawer, Amy said, her voice small and scared. It says we have to leave. Tommy, who'd been coloring at the table, looked up with wide eyes. We have to leave. Where will we go? Robert felt his heart break into 1,000 pieces. This was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. He pulled both kids into a hug, holding them tight. Listen to me, he said firmly. I'm going to fix this. I promise you I'm going to figure it out. We're not going to lose our home, but how? Amy asked, her face buried in his shoulder. You're already working all the time. You're so tired, Dad. I see how tired you are. I'll find a way, Robert said, even though he had no idea how. Have I ever broken a promise to you? Amy shook her head. Then trust me now, okay? She nodded, but Robert could see the doubt in her eyes. She was 10 years old enough to understand that sometimes adults couldn't keep their promises. No matter how hard they tried that night after putting the kids to bed, Robert sat at his kitchen table with his laptop, looking at his bank account. He had $243. Rent was $1,500 a month, and he was 2 months behind. $3,000. He might as well need $3 million. He looked at job listings, hoping for something that paid better. But everything required qualifications he didn't have or would take weeks to start. He didn't have weeks. Robert's phone buzzed. His brother calling. They hadn't spoken in 6 months, but maybe this was a sign. Maybe he could ask for help, just this once. Hey, Robert answered. Robert, hi. Listen, I saw something weird on the news today. There's this story about a billionaire who almost died. Some guy saved her life with CPR. They showed security footage from a park, and I swear it looked like you. Was that you? Robert frowned. What? No, I don't. Wait, when was this? Yesterday. It's all over the news. They're looking for the guy who saved her. There's even a reward. After hanging up with his brother, Robert turned on his television. Sure enough, There it was, on the evening news. Footage of a park that looked familiar. A reporter talking about Catherine Westwood, CEO of Westwood Industries. It's one of the wealthiest women in the country. The woman he'd saved was a billionaire. Robert stared at the screen in shock. The reporter was talking about a reward, about how desperately the family wanted to find the mystery hero. They showed a phone number to call with information. Robert's first instinct was to ignore it. He hadn't saved that woman for money or recognition. He'd done it because it was the right thing to do. But then he thought about Amy's tear-stained face. It's about Tommy's scared eyes, about the eviction notice with 10 days left on the clock. Maybe this was the answer to his prayers. Maybe this was how he'd keep his promise to his kids. But something held him back. Taking money for saving someone's life felt wrong, like he'd be cheapening what he'd done. He'd always believed you helped people because it was right, not because you'd get something out of it. Robert turned off the television and went to bed. He had to be up in 4 hours for his warehouse shift. He'd figure out what to do tomorrow. Right now, he needed sleep more than he needed answers. What he didn't know was that the decision was about to be taken out of his hands entirely. Wednesday arrived faster than Robert wanted it to. Amy's school play was tonight, and he'd kept his promise. He'd asked his supervisor for the evening off, willing to lose the pay if it meant being there for his daughter. Surprisingly, his boss had agreed without much argument. But the day started with another problem. Tommy woke up with a fever and complaining that his arm hurt. Robert felt his forehead warm but not burning and asked what happened. "I fell on the playground yesterday," Tommy admitted, holding his left arm carefully. "It really hurts, Dad." Robert gently examined the arm. Tommy winced when he touched a spot near his wrist. It might be sprained, or it might be broken. Either way, he needed to get it checked out. "All right, buddy. We're going to the hospital to make sure it's okay." Amy looked worried. "But Dad, my play is at 7. You promised." "I know, sweetheart. We'll be back in time, I promise." The emergency room shouldn't take too long. Robert hoped that was true. Even though he knew hospital waits could stretch for hours, they arrived at the emergency room just after 8 in the morning. Robert signed in, and they were told it would be about a 2-hour wait. He sat in the plastic chairs with his kids, Tommy leaning against him, Amy fidgeting nervously with her play script. An hour passed, then another. Finally, they called Tommy's name. The doctor examined his arm, sent them for x-rays, and then made them wait again for the results. Robert kept checking his watch. It was already noon. The play started at 7. They still had time, but the window was closing. The x-rays showed a hairline fracture. Tommy needed a cast. Robert felt relief that it wasn't worse, mixed with worry about how he'd pay for this. His insurance had a high deductible that he hadn't met. This visit would probably cost hundreds of dollars he didn't have. But Tommy needed the cast. So Robert signed the forms and tried not to think about it. They were in the casting room when someone knocked on the door. A nurse poked her head in, but not the one who'd been helping them. This woman was older, with gray hair and kind eyes that looked familiar somehow. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. "But are you the gentleman who helped that woman in the park last week? The one who had a heart attack?" Robert froze. Yes, how did you know?" The nurse's face lit up. "I thought I recognized you. I work in the cardiac unit. I saw you that day when you came in with the ambulance. I've been watching the news reports, and when I saw you in the waiting room today, I just had to make sure." "News reports?" Robert asked, confused. "You don't know? It's been all over the television. The woman you saved is Catherine Westwood. She owns Westwood Industries. She's been looking for you everywhere." Amy grabbed her father's hand. "Dad, that's the billionaire lady they were talking about on TV." The nurse pulled out her phone. "They've been running stories for days. She wants to thank you. She's desperate to find you." She showed Robert the screen, where a news article displayed a headline about the mystery hero who'd saved a billionaire's life. Robert stared at the phone, his mind racing. "I didn't know who she was. I just wanted to help. That's what makes it so special," the nurse said gently. "Listen, Mrs. Westwood's family has been in contact with the hospital, asking us to watch for anyone matching your description. Would it be okay if I let them know we found you?" Robert wanted to say no. He wanted to take his kids and leave, and pretend this conversation never happened. But Amy was looking up at him with those big eyes, and he remembered the eviction notice. 8 days left now, okay? He said quietly. The nurse made a phone call, stepping out of the room for privacy. Tommy got his cast, bright blue, because that was his favorite color, and by the time they were done, the nurse returned. Mrs. Westwood is on her way, she said. She asked if you could wait for just a bit. She really wants to meet you properly. Robert checked his watch again, 2:30. They still had time to get home before Amy's play. All right, we'll wait. They were moved to a private waiting room, much nicer than the crowded emergency room. Amy kept looking at her dad with a mixture of awe and confusion. Tommy was more interested in his new cast and asking everyone who walked by to sign it. 30 minutes later, the door opened, and Robert recognized her immediately. Catherine Westwood looked healthier than the last time he'd seen her, color back in her face, but her eyes were the same. Those eyes that had looked up at him with fear and then gratitude in the park. She wasn't alone. A younger man in an expensive suit followed her, probably her son based on the resemblance. Along with a woman carrying a briefcase and 2 security guards who waited outside, Catherine stopped when she saw Robert, her hand going to her chest in an emotional gesture. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then she crossed the room and did something Robert didn't expect. She hugged him. Not a polite hug, but a real one, the kind you give someone who means something to you. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for giving me more time with my family. Robert awkwardly patted her back, uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment. I just did what anyone would do. Catherine pulled back, wiping tears from her eyes. No, not anyone. Most people would have frozen. Most people wouldn't have known what to do. You saved my life. She looked at Amy and Tommy. Are these your children? Yes, ma'am. This is Amy and Tommy. Catherine smiled at them warmly. You have a very brave father. He's a hero. Amy beamed with pride. Tommy just wanted to show everyone his cast. Please, sit down, Catherine said, gesturing to the chairs. I've been searching for you for days. I was beginning to think I'd never find you. They all sat, and Robert felt extremely out of place in his worn jeans and warehouse jacket, sitting across from one of the wealthiest women in the country. Her son kept looking at him with an expression Robert couldn't quite read. Curiosity, maybe, or assessment. I want to do something for you, Catherine said. To thank you properly. I've set up a reward, but I suspect that's not something you care much about. Robert shifted uncomfortably. I didn't save you for money. I don't want anything. I know you didn't. That's exactly why I want to help. Catherine leaned forward. Tell me about yourself. What do you do? What's your life like? Robert didn't want to talk about his struggles with a stranger, even one he'd saved. But something about Catherine's genuine interest made the words come out. He told her about losing his wife, about working 2 jobs, about trying to be both parents to his kids. Amy suddenly spoke up. We're going to lose our apartment. We have an eviction notice, Amy. Robert said sharply, embarrassed. But Catherine just looked at him with understanding. Is this true? Robert wanted to lie, but what was the point? I'm a little behind on rent. I'm working on it. How far behind? Catherine asked gently. 2 months. I have 8 days to come up with the money, or we're out. Catherine looked at her son, and something passed between them. An entire conversation in a glance. How much do you need? She asked. I'm not asking you for money, Robert said firmly. That's not why I agreed to meet you. I know that. But I'm asking, how much? Robert hesitated. $3,000. But I'll figure it out. I always do. Catherine nodded slowly. And the medical bills from your wife's illness? You mentioned those earlier. It's different. That's not your concern, but I'm making it my concern. Catherine pulled out her phone. What if I could help you? Not as charity, but as gratitude. You gave me the most precious gift anyone can give. More time with the people I love. Please, let me do something meaningful in return. Robert shook his head. I can't take your money. It wouldn't be right. Why not? Because I didn't save you to get something out of it. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Catherine smiled, and for the first time, Robert saw real respect in her eyes. You're a good man. But being a good man doesn't mean you have to struggle when help is offered. Think about your children. Rebel looked at Amy, who was watching him hopefully. At Tommy, swinging his legs in his chair, oblivious to how much this moment mattered. He thought about the eviction notice, about the medical bills, about driving until 3 in the morning and still not having enough. I don't know, he said finally. Catherine stood up. Think about it, please. I'm going to give you my personal number. Call me when you've made a decision. She handed him a business card. In the meantime, consider the hospital bill for your son's arm taken care of. That's non-negotiable. Mrs. Westwood, Catherine. And I mean it. That bill is paid. You've saved my life. Let me at least cover a hospital visit. Before Robert could argue further, Amy tugged on his sleeve. Dad, what time is it? Robert checked his watch, and his heart sank. 6:15. Amy's play started at 7, and they were 30 minutes from home. She needed to be at school by 6:30 to get ready. We have to go, Robert said, standing up quickly. Amy has a school play. Of course, Catherine said. Go, but please, think about what I said. And call me. They rushed out of the hospital, Robert's mind spinning with everything that had just happened. They made it to Amy's school with 5 minutes to spare. She ran inside to get into her costume while Robert and Tommy found seats in the auditorium. As the lights dimmed and the play began, Robert sat there with Catherine's business card in his pocket, feeling like his entire world had shifted. For the first time in 3 years, there was a possibility of hope, and he had no idea what to do with it. Robert barely slept that night. He kept turning Catherine's business card over in his hands, reading her name, looking at the personal cell phone number she'd written on the back. His phone sat on the nightstand, silent and waiting. The play had been wonderful. Amy had been so happy to see him in the audience, exactly where he'd promised he'd be. Afterward, she'd hugged him tight and said thank you over and over. Those moments made everything worth it, all the exhaustion and struggle. But now, in the quiet darkness of his bedroom, reality crept back in. 7 days until eviction. The landlord had called again, less patient this time. Pay or leave. Those were his options. Robert thought about what Catherine had said. Being a good man doesn't mean you have to struggle when help is offered. But accepting her money felt like cheating somehow, like he was taking advantage of a situation. He'd saved her life because it was right not to get paid for it. On the other hand, what about Amy and Tommy? Didn't they deserve stability? Didn't they deserve a father who wasn't exhausted all the time? Who could actually be present in their lives, instead of constantly working? He picked up his phone 3 times that night. 3 times, he put it back down without calling. The next morning, Robert dropped the kids at school and went to work, like always. His supervisor noticed he seemed distracted. Everything okay? David asked during their break. Robert told him everything. About saving Catherine Westwood, about her offer to help, about his hesitation to accept. David looked at him like he'd grown a second head. Are you insane? The woman wants to help you. Let her help you. But I didn't do it for money. Nobody's saying you did. But Robert, man, look at yourself. You're running on fumes. You're going to collapse if you keep going like this. And then what happens to your kids? Robert didn't have an answer for that evening. After picking up Amy and Tommy from school, they stopped at a small playground near their apartment. Tommy wanted to show off his cast to his friends, and Amy sat on the swing next to Robert, moving back and forth slowly. She said quietly, Are you going to call that lady? I don't know, honey. She seemed really nice, and she wants to help us. Robert looked at his daughter, so much more perceptive than any 10-year-old should have to be. It's complicated, why? Because of pride? That word hit Robert harder than he expected. Where did you hear that? Mom used to say it. When Grandma offered to help with bills, and you always said no. Mom said you had too much pride sometimes. Mommy's eyes filled with tears. But Mom's not here anymore, Dad, and we need help. It's okay to need help. Robert pulled her close, his own eyes stinging. Out of the mouths of children came wisdom he wasn't ready to hear. His wife had said the same thing to him many times. He'd always been the type to handle things himself, to never ask for assistance. to prove he could take care of his family alone. But maybe Amy was right. Maybe it was time to let go of that pride. That night, after putting the kids to bed, Robert sat at his kitchen table and pulled out Catherine's card one more time. His hand shook slightly as he dialed the number. She answered on the second ring. "Hello, Mrs. Westwood. It's Robert. From the park." Robert. He could hear the smile in her voice. "I'm so glad you called. Have you thought about my offer?" "I have, and I need to be honest with you. This is really hard for me. I've never been good at accepting help, I understand. But this isn't charity, Robert. You gave me my life back. You gave my grandchildren more time with their grandmother. You can't put a price on that." Robert took a deep breath. "My daughter said something to me today. She said I have too much pride. And she's right. I've been so focused on doing everything myself that I forgot it's okay to accept help when it's genuinely offered." "Your daughter sounds very wise." "She is." "She's had to grow up too fast." Robert paused. "If your offer still stands, I'd like to accept it. Not all of it, just enough to keep us in our apartment and get caught up on some bills. I can handle the rest." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "What if I told you I had a different idea? Something that would help you long term, not just right now." "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about this a lot over the past few days. You're working 2 jobs, running yourself into the ground. What if you only needed one job? A good job with benefits and reasonable hours?" Robert frowned. "I don't have the qualifications for that kind of work. You have something better? You have character. You have integrity. You stay calm in emergencies. You care about people." Catherine paused. "I have a company that needs a facilities manager at one of our warehouses. It's a leadership position, supervising maintenance and safety operations. The pay is nearly double what you're making now, with full benefits and a normal schedule. No more night driving. No more working yourself to exhaustion." Robert couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Why would you offer me that?" "Because I believe in you. Because in that park, you showed me who you are. And that's exactly the kind of person I want working for my company. I don't know what to say. Yes. Take the job. Let me pay off your back rent and your medical debts. Let me set up education funds for Amy and Tommy, and then let's call it even." Robert felt tears running down his face. "That's too much. It's not enough. It will never be enough for what you did. But it's a start." Catherine's voice softened. "Please, Robert, let me do this. Not because you need saving, but because you deserve it. You deserve to have time with your children. You deserve to not be exhausted every day. You deserve a chance to breathe." Robert thought about Amy's face at her school play, about Tommy's excitement over his blue cast, about the 3 years he'd spent just surviving, never really living, about his wife, who would want him to accept this opportunity. "Okay," he whispered. "Yes, thank you." "No," Catherine said firmly. "Thank you." The next few weeks passed in a blur that felt like a dream. Catherine's people handled everything. The back rent was paid. The eviction notice disappeared. Robert went to his new job, which turned out to be everything Catherine promised. His co-workers respected him. His hours were reasonable. And for the first time in years, he came home before dark. The medical bills that had hung over him like a dark cloud were gone. Catherine had set up trust funds for both kids that would cover their college education completely. Robert tried to argue about that part, but Catherine just smiled and told him to pick his battles. 3 months later, Robert's life looked completely different. He woke up at a reasonable hour. He made breakfast with his kids without rushing. He got home in time to help with homework and make dinner. On weekends, they went to the park or the library or just spent time together without. Robert falling asleep from exhaustion, Catherine had become a regular part of their lives too. She came to Tommy's soccer games and Amy's school events. She wasn't trying to replace anyone, but she'd become something like a grandmother to them, filling a space that had been empty since Robert's parents passed away. One Saturday afternoon, Robert took Amy and Tommy to the same park where everything had changed. They sat on the bench where he'd been eating his lunch that day, watching other families enjoy the sunshine. "Dad," Tommy said, leaning against him, "are you happy now?" Robert thought about that question. He thought about the years of struggle, the grief, the exhaustion. He thought about the moment he'd run to help a stranger without hesitation. He thought about how one act of kindness had somehow saved 2 lives that day, not just one. "Yeah, buddy," Robert said, pulling both his kids close. "I'm happy." Amy looked up at him. "Do you think Mom would be proud of you?" "I think she'd be proud of all of us. We made it through the hard times, and we never stopped being kind. That's what matters." That evening, Catherine joined them for dinner at Robert's apartment, which he could now afford to keep without fear. She brought dessert, and they sat around the small kitchen table, laughing and sharing stories. As Robert watched Catherine help Tommy with his homework while Amy showed them both a drawing she'd made, he realized something important. He'd spent 3 years believing he had to do everything alone, that accepting help was weakness. But real strength wasn't about never needing help. It was about being brave enough to accept it when it was offered with genuine love. He'd saved Catherine's life in that park. But in the months since, she'd saved his too. Not with money, though that helped. But by showing him that it was okay to be human, to struggle, to need support. By showing him that accepting kindness wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. That night, after Catherine left and the kids were asleep, Robert started something new. He enrolled in a CPR certification class at the community center. If he could teach others what he knew, maybe someone else would be ready when they were needed most, because that's what he'd learned from all of this. Life wasn't about working yourself to death or proving you could handle everything alone. It was about showing up for people, helping when you could, and accepting help when you needed it. It was about creating chains of kindness that rippled outward in ways you could never predict. Robert had gone to that park just to eat a sandwich in peace. He'd left with his entire life changed. And all because he'd made the simple choice to help someone who needed him. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest miracles. Sometimes saving someone else is exactly what you need to save yourself.